All right, back for part two. Um, so I decided to replace the pump with a quality pump, of quality fuel pump. Cost about 120 bucks. They're not cheap, but OEM parts are the best to get. Factory parts that you can get for the bike, they're the best to get. I went through Cycle Parts Nation, and they've got Honda, Kawasaki, and all kinds of stuff. So put the new factory fuel pump in the bike. And I went to turn the ignition on, and you're supposed to like hear a couple seconds of it priming, either like a priming the carburetor. Sometimes it's like a zzz, like kind of a grinding sound. You're supposed to hear it prime, and I wasn't hearing it prime. Like, well, maybe I need a fuel pump relay. Maybe the relay's out. So I did some testing on the cables there, and it looked like I had good voltage and everything going to the fuel pump. But the relay, there wasn't a good solid way to test that. It was just I had voltage going to the fuel pump relay, good voltage coming from it to the pump. So I replaced the fuel pump relay. Still the same problem. Something I did notice was that my voltage at the fuel pump relay, which should read battery voltage. So if my battery's sitting there and it has 12.8 volts, I should read about 12.8, maybe 12.5, somewhere in that range at the fuel pump relay, because it's just going from the battery. You got the battery that goes to the starter, the ignition switch, and then ignition switch through a fuse, and then to the ICM or the fuel pump relay. And the ICM is the ignition control module, which is the computer for timing and all of this stuff, and it tells the fuel pump when to kick on and when to kick off. So the fuel pump relay, that is, when to kick on and when to kick off. So anyway, I was getting 11.4 volts there. So I was getting power, but there was probably resistance in the line somewhere. And I was thinking maybe it's not enough to turn on the fuel pump relay. So I was kind of pursuing that option. I had taken apart the right crankcase cover to look at the pulse generator, and that reads basically your crankshaft as your engine's going. It'll kind of determine what kind of a pulse, the signal of pulse in the motorcycle. So I thought maybe that was the issue. That wasn't the issue. I ended up breaking off a couple bolts from that one, and that was a kind of a fiasco. So I got that back on. That clearly wasn't the issue. I was getting spark from all of the cylinders, but I had noticed before I tested the spark, I pulled off one of the cables and it came out of the boot for the spark plug, and it was corroded. So it's like it had been a loose connection for a while. I was like, well, this has got to be it then. And I kept finding these issues where I'm like, this is bad, this is bad, this is bad. So I replaced all of the spark plug cables. Still wasn't the issue. It needed to be replaced. They were all things that needed to be replaced, but it wasn't the main problem. So I replaced those. I'm getting spark on all four cylinders, so it's not my ignition coils. I had started testing some things, some of the connections at the ICM, the ignition control module. I thought maybe the ignition control module's out. Maybe it's faulty and it's not sending the information the right way. I had taken out the carbs a total of probably 6 times and I did a pine saw clean on them and boiled them and gone through the jets again, replaced some gaskets, even stuff that had nothing to do with the issue. I was just like, you know what, they need it. New float bowl gaskets, a new needle valve seat. I just kind of replaced some things in there. All of the fuel lines and the vent lines that were going from the carburetor elsewhere or to the carburetor, I replaced. The fuel line going from the fuel pump into the carburetor, I replaced. I replaced the petcock valve, which is it's the on-off gasoline switch on your gas tank that turns fuel into the fuel filter, to the fuel pump, and then into the carburetor. I thought maybe that was it, if it was like a vacuum issue. And maybe some of these things needed fixed, maybe they didn't. Some of them certainly did. I found faulty things. There's obviously the spark plug cables, the fuel pump, the burned connector. These were all things that weren't quite working. And since I actually hardwired this connector, I started noticing normal readings. I was getting in the 14 volt range. under load, and so my battery was getting charged. The charging system was back underway, and but I had done a radiator flush. I had just kind of gone through this whole system of things trying to figure out what's going on. I had gotten on a website called justanswer.com where you can talk to experts, mechanics, and things, and talk to a guy there, and he's like, oh, well, it could be your boots, your intake boots. There's a vacuum leak, and I was like, well, I've already checked that. I actually got brand new intake boots that go from the carburetor to the engine. The old ones weren't bad, but they were a little hard, so I thought maybe it was losing some flexibility there. So I replaced those. I replaced the boots coming from the airbox into the carburetor. Those are the only 4 areas between the air coming into the bike and the engine that you should have a leak, an air leak, in theory. There are probably a couple other areas, but I replaced those. I resealed the airbox. Before I put the carburetors back on the bike, I did an air test with an air compressor, shot them into the vent holes of the carburetor and into the mouth of the carburetor, and you should see the pressure in between the top of the slide cover and the slides. There's air that collects in there, and that's what raises it up. I was doing that, and my slides were raising just fine. So I'd put the carbs back on the bike, I'd let it idle, and I'd sprayed the intakes, all of them, just to see if it was starved of fuel and there was a vacuum leak, it would pull that starting fluid in and then kick on or change the RPMs, and it didn't. So that wasn't my issue. So I just kind of kept going on. Just Answer, the mechanics there weren't giving me clear answers. They're like, you're doing everything that we would. Maybe you could try this, and everything I tried wouldn't work. I had called local mechanics in the areas and asked them the same questions. They said, well, maybe it could be ignition timing, which again, timing on my bike is controlled by the ICM. So if the ICM goes out, it's $250. And I'm like, well, let's wait to take care of that one. So it could have been something inside the engine, valve springs, valves, bent valves, stuck valves. It could have been a number of things in there. That's my last resort to get into the engine. I'll do it. I don't mind doing it, but obviously you're changing out gaskets, and I'd rather just figure everything else out first. So all these mechanics were telling me, you're doing everything that we would do. And I had a couple buddies saying, just take it into a shop. But by this point, I had already spent hundreds of dollars on these replacement parts, and nothing was quite fixing it. And mechanics were telling me, if we take it in there and just diagnose it, because I wanted them to diagnose it, I'll fix it. Just diagnose it. Even if it's in pieces, I'll get a trailer and take it back to my garage. They're like, well, we might as well just fix it while we're in there, and if we got to get into the engine, this could be like between $400 and $600. I'm like, I can't waste any more money on this right now. So anyway, I bought replacement fuel pump, and it looks like everything was working. I wasn't hearing it prime, but with some of these carbureted bikes, you don't hear it kick on right away, and I don't know why that is, but you don't. My manual, which is actually it's a climber guide. If anyone working on a bike does not have a repair manual, it has troubleshooting guides. It has color-coded wiring diagrams. It's got just about everything you need. Between that, mechanics that online, YouTube and communities, you can figure things out. But if you don't have a manual and you're trying to figure out an issue, you're just shooting yourself in the foot. Get a manual. So anyway, I'm following everything that the manual says, and nothing is adding up. So I go on a community called HondaShadow.net, Honda Shadow Forum. And it's just an open forum. You can post technical issues you're having. It's just a community of people that own Honda Shadows, and it's amazing. I don't know if they have it for other bikes, but they've got it for the Honda Shadow, which I'm very grateful for. And a couple guys were talking to me about some things on there, and one guy was mentioning, he said, make sure that you don't have a kinked vacuum hose or an air relief hose on your carburetors, because it has to be equalized pressure, which I understood. And it had been 3 years at least since I've worked on this bike, and I just wasn't paying attention to the concept of how things were working. So when I got the bike, my buddy that had worked on it, from what I'm assuming, he hasn't told me yet, but the way that things were routed from the carburetor were actually incorrect. The vent lines coming from the float bowls in the carburetor are supposed to come together in a T and then vent out to the air, because the fumes of the gas that are in there, you need to release those. So they need to go out to the air, and it usually comes down at the bottom of the bike. Same thing happens for the gas tank. It needs relief. If you were to just pour a portable tank of gas and it doesn't have a relief hole, it's hard to get that gas out. Once you get a relief hole, it equalizes the pressure and the gas can flow. So what had happened was the T connector coming from the carburetor had a hose coming out of that connecting to the relief hole on the gas tank. I know this sounds crazy. I'm probably going to get comments on here like, how did you not catch that? But this is just how it was when the bike had stopped. This is how it was routed. And I didn't second guess that because I knew my knowledge of the carburetor that I'd worked on this bike in the past, but I wasn't thinking about the vent lines and how they needed to go. I just wasn't. I just wasn't thinking of it. So my buddy, for whatever reason, had routed it that way. And he didn't know the bike as well as I did. And when he had it, I think he only worked on it a couple times. So it was just routed that way. So the gas tank wasn't equalizing in pressure, and the carburetors weren't equalizing in their pressure. They didn't have any vent. So between those two, that's why I couldn't get acceleration. So, when I read that, I'm like, something's not making sense here. And so I go back to the bike and I look, and that's what I found. So I vented the gas tank down to the bottom of the bike, and I vented the carburetor down to the bottom of the bike, started it up, ran like a champ. And that's what fixed my issue. The reason I wanted to make this video is for a couple reasons. One, this was such an anomaly. I don't get stumped by a lot. I'm a do-it-yourselfer with a lot of stuff. And this YouTube channel is not just for motorcycle stuff. I mean, it'll be house projects and remodeling and music and all kinds of stuff. Anything that I can help the world out with what I know how to do, that's what I'm going to be sharing on here. But I don't get stumped much by mechanical things or fixing things. And this just didn't make sense to me at all. And in a good way, this made me check a lot of different systems where I found things like this burnt connector. I found the corroded wire, the plug wire. I found a lot of different things that were going wrong. This was a multi-system failure on my motorcycle. I just happened to get through it, and I found that, and it took me about 4 months. I'm in Indianapolis, and it's November 2nd or 3rd right now. So we're at the end of riding season, and I'm not going to probably be able to ride this motorcycle until the spring, and that's okay. I just wanted to know that it was good to go. So if you're having trouble, especially with your throttle or any other system on your bike, understand how a motorcycle works. Take the time in your spare time just to research things, understand exactly what comes into a carburetor, what goes out of a carburetor. If you have a fuel-injected system, understand how the injectors work, what your line is from the gas tank all the way out to the exhaust, from your battery to every single terminal, what resistance readings are supposed to be. Just understand it. Get your mind into it, and that's just going to help your troubleshooting. If you have any questions, and especially if you have a Honda Shadow, go on hondashadow.net. Amazing place, amazing community of people that just help you out. But if you have any questions, especially in this process, I've gained such a knowledge on things I thought I knew, but I didn't know on motorcycles. So hit me up, like the YouTube channel. I'm sure there's going to be more things that you might be able to gain, and we'll see you at the next video.